Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Masters Interviews, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a podcast-style chat with somebody from the wargaming community, usually and ideally more experienced and interesting than me, who can share a few insights and hopefully help newer wargamers either get into the hobby or stay in the hobby, hopefully forever. Today's guest, I'm going to say it's a bit of a coup. 4 episodes into Masters Interviews, it's our first equivalent of a coup, certainly. He is probably one of the hobby's, I'm going to say, great communicators and champions, public-facing champions. Among his talents is a designer, writer, and editor. He's been active for an awfully long time. He's also the former editor of Miniature Wargames with Battlegames magazine, also Battlegames magazine. We'll get into the history of that in a bit. He's run the Battlegames website since 1998, which you can find your way to all sorts of wonderful things like podcasts, blog posts. There's a YouTube channel, all sorts of things. And he's also got a Patreon as well. He's gone that way too. One of his taglines is "The Spirit of Wargaming." It is Henry Hyde. Hello, Henry. How are you? Welcome to...
What an introduction. What an introduction. That is, I'm humbled. What can I say? Thank you so much.
But we've got Henry on today because I'm going to try not to baffle the listeners with too much stuff, and we'll try and keep some sort of structure to this, because we could talk to Henry for probably about 48 hours solid, but I think we'd all run out of tea, and we get very tired. So I'm going to try and keep it fairly focused. But there's a couple of things that if you're getting into the hobby, you might not know about Henry. So number one is his podcast is great. It's an awesome place to go for just to listen. You know, you can tune in and you don't have to pay a penny. You can hear him talk to some fascinating people who do really cool things like run shows and design models and all sorts of things. But interestingly, which we'll go into a bit later, is that most recently Henry's also been documenting his journey through prostate cancer. He took the decision of having been diagnosed in October 2019, and having recently finished radiotherapy, actually, to go all out there with a video blog as well. He didn't just put one post up. He's documented that, and he's done an awful lot, I'd imagine, for a lot of people in terms of how open he's been about it. So we'll go into that too. But we'll start, as we do with a lot of people. Now we've gone through all that, we'll start at the beginning, Henry. When and we're going to go through a bit of a potted history with all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Not ending with the publication of the Wargaming Compendium book, which was published by Pen and Sword in 2013. But how did this start, Henry? When did you first pick up a miniature, or see a miniature, and think, I'll have a bit of that?
Crikey. We are talking Jurassic period, I think, maybe Cretaceous. No, seriously. I come from that generation of lads whose father had done things in the war, the Second World War. My dad served in the Fleet Air Arm, and he wasn't a pilot or anything glamorous like that. He was basically an air mechanic. He fixed all sorts of aircraft, ended up going to Canada halfway through the war and training Canadian air crew and air mechanics. And he had a fantastic time in Canada. He certainly had a better time there than he'd had in places like Biggin Hill and various aerodromes around southern Britain that the Luftwaffe were more interested in. But yeah, he came back from the war, and I was born 1961, which was an interesting time because of just prior to that, in the late 50s, the birth of a particular company that you cannot ignore if you're talking to someone from my generation. And that company was called Airfix. And of course, it's still going. It's gone through a number of ups and downs over the decades, but it's still going.
Even I've got a couple of kits.
Well, there you go. And of course, Airfix were famous for doing model kits, and that's something my dad used to love to do for me. Of course, the first stuff he made for me was all those World War II aircraft that he used to service. So the Fairey Swordfishes and the Grumman Avengers and all these kind of things. And we'd make them together. Obviously, it would mostly be him doing the making and painting, but then we'd hang them on cotton from my bedroom ceiling. So I would go to bed at night and have a torch, like a searchlight, and imagine all these things, and all the Battle of Britain aircraft, the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, the Lancaster bombers, the Wellingtons, all those kind of stuff.
Do you know what's cool about that, Henry? Is that I do exactly the same thing with my son.
Really? That's wonderful.
Got a Hurricane hanging from a piece of cotton in his bedroom.
That's absolutely wonderful.
Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, it's lovely to hear. And because it is something, there's something almost kind of primeval, the father-son thing, that dad wanting to make stuff for son and introduce him to that kind of stuff if you're creatively inclined, So my dad did that for me. And of course, then also there are all the tank models, all the Airfix came out with the Tigers and the Churchills and the Shermans and the Panthers and the Stugs and what have you.
Yeah.
And that playing on the carpet, just making tanky sort of noises and bang noises and what have you. But the most important things, of course, were all those boxes of 1/72nd scale, or HOOO, as they were also known as, because of model railways, crossover, of the little plastic soldiers, what we now call soft plastic soldiers, polyethylene soldiers, with 8th Army, the Japanese, the US Marines, and the paratroopers, the commando set, if people remember the commando set with the little guys in the little canoe and everything. And the first kind of
the famous canoe. I've never seen it, but I've heard about the canoe set.
Yeah. Oh, I've got one. It comes out on high days and holidays. But then the first kind of other than World War II figures they did Romans and ancient Britons, and of course purist ancient British historians scream at the chariot because it was like a solid log wheel, almost like a Flintstone wheel chariot that they had. And we now know, of course, the ancient Britons were amazing carpenters and made beautiful chariots that were anything other than clunky. So battles were fought between Romans and ancient Britons on the carpet, and then probably the most versatile of the lot, and famous wargamer, sadly now deceased, Donald Featherstone, was the champion of the American Civil War sets, the Union and Confederate infantry and the US cavalry and the artillery set, from which adventurous wargamers back in those days, because there was almost nothing else available, we would chop up and carve and use plasticine to add to convert these figures into all sorts of stuff. Then a few years later, they started coming out with a Napoleonic set. So by the time I was at high school, I was able to collect my first proper Napoleonic armies. Wow. And I had absolutely vast armies of British and French, and some convert. So by now, because my dad died when I was 10. So by now I'm at, the early years of high school. So I'd be 11, 12, 13, that kind of age. And I was a complete nut for kind of Napoleonic war game. There was a particular author called Bruce Quarry, who, he said, reaching across to his thingammy that's just here, back in the early 70s when I was off to high school, wrote this book that I'm holding up to the screen here called Napoleonic Wargaming, the Airfix Guide to Napoleonic Wargaming. And for a young mind at that time, it was an absolute godsend. Now I look at it and think, oh my God, it's so hyper detailed, unnecessarily detailed, to the point where your Austrian Fusiliers march 5 millimeters slower than your French Fusiliers, who in turn march 10 millimeters slower than Middle Guard Grenadiers, and so it was just bananas. Figure scale of 1 to 33, so nothing that you can easily get your head around. But it's amazing. By the age of 12, I knew my 33 times table, right? Because all the casualties were calculated in actual men, not figures. So you do this horrendously long plus. Oh, right. So the range is 760 millimeters.
Yeah.
So that's -2. You're behind the hedge. That's a -1 as well. But we've got a commander nearby. So that's +1. And it's our first shot. So there's another +1. All right. So that's +3. Okay. With our fire factors, this. So it's +3 at -2. All right. So that means I've caused 38 casualties. So take off one figure and carry the 5 over.
Good.
That's what gaming was like for a lot of us in the 1970s. And the thing is, now, of course, I look back and think, oh my God, how on earth, as young wargamers, did we put up with that kind of thing? Now I yearn for simplicity. It's like, just tell me, Chris, how many figures do I take off the board, right? That's all I want to know. Is it 3 or 4?
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's very easy for people like me to think, oh, well, what people want is simple rules. Whereas actually, particularly adolescent boys, they love detail. Yeah. They love the fact that this thing, they love the fact that this thing is slightly different from that thing and so on. But anyway, so that was kind of the transition I made. But I'd started kind of properly playing war games, I suppose, just before my dad died. So I was probably about 8 or 9, because dad built me a toy fort. That's something else he did, right? Toy fort. So obviously I would have, the Robin of Sherwood Forest airfix set and Sheriff of Nottingham airfix set, so you'd have medieval kind of castle raids and stuff. But back then it was, I'd started kind of organizing things into regiments, and I'd understood from Dad, because he told me, oh no, guys all march in step, they learn drill and this kind of stuff. And he was a big man for books. So we had all kinds of books on military history and encyclopedias where I could see, oh yes, Trooping the Colour. I think he took me to see Trooping the Colour before he fell seriously ill. So I would have been about 7 or 8, but I can remember up there on Horse Guards Parade, all the, the Guards Brigade doing their thing, an amazing experience. But so I'd started sort of playing war games. I think I might have even started rolling dice, but pretty randomly. Yeah. But it was the first time I actually discovered a proper book of war games rules. Was actually the year Dad died. It was just a couple of months after he died, and I suppose I was quite a shy kid in those days. I spent a lot of time in the local library, and I remember going into I think it was actually Leon C Library rather than Southend, because I was brought up in Essex. Okay. And just walking up and down the kind of the aisle that had military history type stuff and model making stuff and that sort of thing. Okay. And literally stumbled across a book, and again I'm going to reach over and flash it so you can see it, called The War Game by Charles Grant. Published, it was brand new book then, published just a month or 2 earlier. And this was my revelation. And I should say bless you, because that's the most silent sneeze I've ever known. I was fearing the top of your head might blow off.
Blow or sneeze down a microphone at whoever's listening to this. And then
anyway, so this book, which is still precious to me, I've actually got a couple of copies. Charles Grant, who was one of the big names in wargaming at the time, there was Don Featherstone, Charles Grant, Charles Wesencraft, Tony Barth, of course, from the Wargames Research Group, and several other kind of big names, the doyens of the hobby, you might call them, who were the people who were dominating the few magazines and newsletters that were around at the time. Yeah, they were all very eloquent. They knew how to write and express themselves. And they were, these guys who had been in the war, right? And it's quite interesting. You'd think a lot of those guys would not want to have anything more to do with war or fighting or anything. Don Featherstone fought in tanks in North Africa and up into Italy and stuff. Charles Grant was in the RAF. Charlie Wesencroft was an artilleryman. So these people knew what real war was like. And yet, here they were expounding on the joys of playing with toy soldiers. And I think it was that generation that first tried to codify rule sets and stuff and take it away from just being knocking over toy soldiers in the way that H.G. Wells had back in, you know, the days of Little Wars, into something that was more, and let's put this in inverted commas, scientific. So I came on the scene finding this book in 1971, and it was the ideal book for me because Charles Grant had a style that you would have to you know, some people would say he was a bit pompous, really, right? But I would prefer to see it as he was rather avuncular. He was like, you know, your favorite uncle who'd sit you on his knee and explain why things are the way they are. And this whole book is, right, okay, so here's he focused on 18th century wargaming, and something else about that I'll mention in a minute. And he explained, right, okay, in our war game, we organize our figures into units like this: squadrons of cavalry, battalions of infantry, batteries of artillery, and so forth. And this is why we do this. This is what we're trying to represent. This is what it was like in real life. So obviously we can't go out, you know, a real battalion has 1,000 men. We're not going to paint up 1,000 figures for a single battalion and put them on our table, probably because they wouldn't fit on the table. Also, back in those days, they were mostly dealing with what we now call 20, 25 mil or even 30 millimeter figures, right? 6 mil and things like that weren't around. Yeah. So they were all kind of big figurines. Some of them now we look at with affection. I have a particular affection for a brand called Spencer Smith that has almost no detail on it whatsoever. But the story behind them, they were the same figures used by Charles Grant. So the pictures in this book, I grew up thinking, I want those figures. Yeah. I don't care about all these other more fancy figures. I want the figures that were in that book. So when I found, oh, you can buy them. Wow. So he described that, and he described, oh, well, yes, okay, now you've got your battalion of infantry, and he had big battalions, as we now call them, 48 infantry in a battalion, right? Which is a lot of painting. And okay, so now they're going to march 6 inches per turn. And the reason they're marching 6 inches per turn is because we have these things called scales. So we have a ground scale and we have a time scale. So each inch on the table represents 10 yards. Each move represents a minute. So we go back to the historical records and see, what could a man do? How far could he march on level ground or uphill or downhill through woods and what have you in that minute? How many times could he fire his musket? How accurate would his musket be at different ranges, and so on and so forth? So to me, excuse me, just arriving in the hobby, and it enabled that transition from, I'm just playing with these toy soldiers because it's fun, but I don't really know what I'm doing, to that light bulb moment. Oh, I get it now, right? Yeah. And so suddenly, I made that move from just being someone who played with toy soldiers to being a war gamer and understanding what it meant and kind of what it was for, and understanding tactics and understanding the limitations of different troop types, understanding, you know, the obvious things like cavalry move faster than infantry move faster than artillery if it's being dragged, you know. That there's a thing called dead ground. You know, if your troops are in front of a hill, they can't see what's behind the hill. Yeah. You know, the fact that different types of ammunition would have a different effect. That something, you know, the movies, Hollywood, so much to answer for. Exploding cannonballs, right? You see the guys loading the solid shot into the cannon, bang, and then there's this big explosion when it hits the guys at the other end. It's like, that does not compute. They're made of solid iron. So discovering through Charles Grant, there were these things called shells. You know, they were fired by these particular guns called howitzers that could shoot over things and could set things on fire. So from the, you know, just as I was heading off to grammar school, I suddenly felt like oh, I've got this. It's a hobby. It's a proper thing, right? I don't have to be embarrassed anymore. It's a proper thing. People write books about it.
Community, yeah.
Yeah.
There are more than one of us.
Yes. And of course, in the book, Charles Grant mentioned magazines. Now, back then it was military modeling. In the days before the internet, it's kind of hard to grasp that up until, mid 1990s, there was the only way for wargamers to get in touch with one another is if they happened to live in an area where there was a wargames club, right, that they'd found, but they would have found that club in the column inches of a magazine. If they wanted information, well, you could go trawling your local library, but many local libraries didn't have much. So, interlibrary loans, or Military Modelling was the first magazine that did this thing called Uniform Info, where people could write in and say, oh, I've got a model here of a 1750s Pavlov Grenadier from Russia. I've no idea what colour the buttons on his coat should be. So, dear Mr. Editor, can you please tell me what colour the buttons should be? And the editor of Military Modelling magazine at the time obviously had a much greater access to military history library, and he had other experts on hand. So if you were lucky, in a month or 2 or 3, there would be in that column, oh, Mr. Bloggs wrote to us about the Pavlov Grenadiers, and we've discovered that actually it depended on whether it was March 1757 or April 1757. It could have been silver or brass, but anyway, take your choice.
You see
Now,
what's fascinating about this is that, the other day, right, I found a shoebox in my dad's loft.
Oh, yeah.
And I opened it up and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. What it was is 26 years ago, I did Games Workshop for about 9 months.
Yeah.
I collected some Empire and then I got fed up with it, didn't even game with it, sold it all, and that was it. Turns out Mum and Dad took all the bits and pieces, like as in the paint, the paints, a couple of white dwarfs, and just chucked those leftover bits in a shoebox and shoved them in the loft for 26 years. I found it the other day. And inside it, right, is one of these little introducing the hobby of Games Workshop pamphlets.
Yes.
A miniature white dwarf.
Yeah.
And you flick through it and it's like, this is what Games Workshop is. This is what Wargaming is. This is what paints are. All that sort of stuff. And then in there's like a mail order thing at the back.
Yeah.
A list of stores and shops and phone numbers, but there's no mention of the internet. And I was thinking, when I was going through this, the point I'm trying to make is when I was flicking through this thing, I was thinking, oh my God, that seems like the Stone Age. And that seems so difficult now, having to go to the shop to meet people, to tell you how to do things. But you're talking about even before this.
Yeah.
When there was no chain of shops that you could go in and chat to other wargamers.
No. There were hobby shops, and they tended to be general hobby shops, so they would often stock model railway stuff, model aeroplane stuff, as in the flying remote control, radio control aircraft stuff, people who enjoyed making miniature boats. So almost the first thing you'd smell varnish when you stepped into the shop, because there were people who were either putting dope on tissue of the wings of these big aircraft or making, varnishing model boats or whatever. And in the other corner, there's a model railway layout with some Hornby stuff and maybe some really expensive Fleischmann stuff and what have you. And there, if you're lucky, tucked in the corner is a little display of models from, back then it would have been someone like Miniature Figurines or Hinchliffe models or Garrison or someone like that. Many of them now, I mean, I know there's a whole bunch of guys I know who actually have gone back to collecting and playing with some of these really old figures, even though the sculpting on some of them is abominable. Some of those old figures is like, I think it's a horse. Right. All I can say is they have a certain charm. It's obviously nostalgia mixed in, but when the first Games Workshop shop I can remember seeing, I had already moved down here to Brighton, so it would have been in the early 1990s, so maybe kind of 93, something like that, 94.
My 9 months was in 94.
Right.
1994.
Yeah. So it was, that was a revelation, because also back then they sold other stuff that wasn't just Games Workshop stuff, right? The very first Games Workshop that started in London, they didn't have their own brand.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
Chess sets and all the rest of it, Dungeons and Dragons, and it was only when they got started with their own kind of Citadel miniatures and stuff. Because if you've listened to my podcast, you've heard me talk to the Perry twins and Alessio Cavatori and others, and so the history of Games Workshop is a fascinating thing, and it went quite a while before it became this major corporate thing. But then it had to become that. I remember I think I had two podcast discussions with Rick Priestley, the high priest of Games Workshop, as he was for such a long time, describing that, when you start needing to borrow millions and millions of pounds to keep a company going, the investors have quite a big say in the way they want the company to go, so that they know they're going to earn the money back. Yeah. And now, of course, we have to acknowledge that Games Workshop is an astonishing success story. It's now bigger than Marks and Spencer's or whatever it is. It's worldwide.
Most profitable company, I think.
Absolutely astonishing. And I know, because this is then, we're jumping forward a long time. So on my timeline still, that's all right. We're going to jump around a lot today, I know. But on my timeline then, so I at school, I ran the school wargaming club. By the time I reached the kind of 5th, 6th form, I was running the school wargames club, playing all sorts of war games with all sorts of scales of miniatures, anything from like 15 millimeter up to 40 millimeter, all sorts of historical periods. I did a bit of sci-fi gaming. I think I had played a couple of games of Dungeons and Dragons, but I'd not done anything else fantasy based. Because a lot of the fantasy stuff, there were some guys doing kind of rules of battles in Middle Earth, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
But no one at my school was particularly interested in doing that. But I think it was in the 5th or 6th form at school. That was the first time I read The Lord of the Rings. And it blew me away. And I think a lot of people Henry's very historical wargaming. Not true. I was an early reader of, everything to do. And once you read Lord of the Rings, then you read the Silmarillion, you read the Unfinished Tales, you read da-da-da. So I was a Tolkien nut. But I had no kind of gaming outlet for that at the time. Yeah. But so a lot of historical war games. I still had loads of Airfix figures because they were coming out with more and more sets now. I think I bought my first metal figures when I was about 16. Because they were comparatively expensive and hard to get hold of. But I think it was Miniature Figurines. And this will make people laugh. Back in those days, Miniature Figurines was still is one of the biggest figure manufacturers in the country. They were based in Southampton. And the company was run by a guy called Neville Dickinson, who's very old-fashioned. He's still around, bless him. And they used to pack their figures in sawdust. So you'd get...
Yeah.
You'd get, first of all, the weight would be, if it came within 28 days, you were lucky, right? That's the first thing. So you'd have to get the magazine or order their catalogue, right, and wait for that to arrive. And you go through this big printed catalogue and thousands and thousands of product codes, most of which had no photographs of what the miniatures actually looked like. So you were taking it completely on faith, or because magazines like Military Modelling at the time had reviewed some of the figures, So it was a real lottery. And when the figures arrived, they'd come in this big brown cardboard box, and you'd open it up and sawdust everywhere. And I tell you what, not so long ago, a couple of years ago, I dug out some of my old Miniature Figurines figures, and I was laughing because stuck under the armpit of this archer was a bit of sawdust that I hadn't noticed for 30 years. Right. So that's different world. Blister packs, what are they? They just didn't exist. Yeah. So there's that kind of nostalgia attached to it.
Yeah.
And then I left school in 1979, went off to university. I went to Sussex University, just down the road from where I live here, actually. Yeah. And I obviously couldn't take all my stuff with me to university. It was impossible. I was living in student accommodation. So it's now what am I going to do? And I met a chap, and we got on really well. And it turned out he'd been, someone who did a bit of wargaming before university as well. And again, it was like, I needed my clothes and, cooking stuff in my suitcase. I couldn't fit any Airfix figures. So we got into board games. We started playing Avalon Hill, Hex and Counter board games, particularly Squad Leader, which just became a thing that just got really stupid because we ended up with massively overambitious and megalomaniac. We fought bigger and bigger and bigger battles because, of course, you keep buying the next supplement, and they changed the rules as well. The rules got more complicated. You thought that Bruce Quarry and his Airfix Guide to Napoleonic Wargaming was complicated. Wait till you see the rules for Squad Leader, right? Yeah. But we had some fantastic games until it just, we drifted apart because he went to America for his year abroad. I went to Germany. Yeah. And it's there in Germany I want to bring something up because Charles Grant, back at the War Game, folks, if you remember that book, The War Game, 1971, yeah. His battles were all set in the 18th century. He was a passionate military historian, a great admirer of Frederick the Great and the 7 Years' War and the War of the Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa. And he refought with his son, Charles Stewart Grant, who's still alive and still cranking out books.
That's him, I think. Recently.
Who you have?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I know.
Is it possible a show or something? He's a retired brigadier now, so very imposing chap. He's a good bloke. Anyway, his dad, instead of actually fighting battles using troops painted up as Prussians and Austrians or British and French, he invented his own countries. And those two countries were Die Vereinigte Freie Städte and the Grand Duchy of Lorraine. Okay, so you'd read these battle reports, he'd refight a historic battle like the Battle of Mollwitz, but instead of him talking about Frederick the Great and the Prussians and the Austrians, he'd be talking about, oh, well, the Grand Duchy of Lorraine did this and the Vereinigte Freie Städte did that, which was fascinating to me because he's a serious bloke, he's a seriously intelligent, upstanding guy, jacket and tie, all that kind of stuff. And yet he invented his own countries for wargaming. And also, it turned out, in the Ancients period, there was lots of Ancients gaming going on. The Wargames Research Group, Tony Bath, Phil Barker, and many others, Charles Grant among them, who were involved in this massive, completely fictitious campaign called Hyboria that ran for years. And they published they used, I think it was Military Modelling and then Battle Magazine. They did kind of monthly reports of what had happened in the campaign and all these deadly serious war games with completely fictitious made up countries that looked like, they could be ancient Greek or ancient Roman or whatever, but had daft names and the kings and queens were all, had stupid names and did stupid things. They were having a laugh. Mm. Now that stayed with me. And so there I was in my year abroad in Germany. So it was 82, 83, the year of the Falklands War. That's the only coincidence. I had nothing to do with the Falklands War, thank goodness. But I was living out in Germany in accommodation on the outskirts of a place called Augsburg, which is in southern Germany, where in the winter it gets very, very, very cold, right? Extremely cold. We're talking like minus 30 outside and 6 feet of snow. So you're kind of stuck in your student accommodation, shivering, wearing your duvet coat indoors still because you can't afford the heating. And my mind went to, Charles Grant needed these fictitious countries. I wonder if I could come up with something like that. And again, there I was in Germany, I had no figures or anything with me. So I invented some countries, right? This was, so we're talking 1982, 83. Yeah. Invented some countries, gave them some silly names, started writing some sort of backstory, silly history stuff, family trees. I even made what I would now call tiny little flat armies because I was a smoker at the time. So I had matchstick and a piece of paper folded at a right angle. So I stuck that to the matchstick. So you had this upstanding front about 5 millimeters tall, and painted lots of little soldiers on. I had this little cheap watercolor set. And so I made, a couple of small armies of these things and just kind of did some, what I would now call, in sounding fancy, free Kriegspiel gaming, right, on my bed, because I had a green duvet, right? And Those countries, that stayed with me. So when I got back to the UK, I told my chum Guy about this. Oh, really? That sounds really interesting. Any chance I could get involved? So after we graduated, so we graduated 83. So from late 83 onwards, I started fleshing this out, and we started a campaign which became what's now known as the Wars of the Faltinian Succession, which featured in my book and featured regularly in my magazine, and which other people have now joined in with. So that's been kind of a thread throughout. And the reason I give that example, Chris, is because I think that, because there's been a debate recently online that you know about, is historical wargaming dying? And one of the problems with youngsters coming into the hobby is they can be intimidated by so-called gatekeepers, who say, oh, well, if you can't paint the right color on that Roman legionary's tunic, well, I don't want to have anything to do with you, sonny, go away, right? That's a very tiny minority of people involved in the hobby. And this, what's now known as imagination gaming, in other words, playing games with armies from totally made up countries, just like you would in fantasy or science fiction gaming, right? It has a proud tradition going way back to the dawn of modern wargaming, to the 1950s.
It's a really interesting point.
And I think that, youngsters or younger people, I think we do have to be careful about some of the terminology, because I think there is a difference if you're trying to literally attract very young people into the hobby, people who are in their pre-teens or early teens, compared to people who are relatively young, say in their 20s or 30s. They're obviously two very different kind of marketplaces, if you like, audiences.
Conversation. I think because we've ended up here already, sort of thing. But just
sorry,
that's okay. No, I'm glad we have. What we're referring to, if people listening, is there's a debate going around the hobby at the moment, which it does seem to go round in cycles. So it seems to come around, from what I can tell, every few years. But it's been started up by Little Wars TV, which is a really good YouTube channel, all about historical wargaming. And they did a video where they asked, is wargaming dying? Was that the completely open?
Is historical wargaming dying?
Wargaming dying. And what they did for that is they posed that question and they interviewed various different people, and they looked at a few statistics, things like that. One of the people interviewed was Henry, who basically said no. Short answer before he elaborated on it. They interviewed all sorts of people like Henry that are involved in the hobby from both sides of the Atlantic, and they started a debate. And perhaps predictably, it did kick off quite a bit on Twitter. I saw stuff on Twitter. I actually got involved a little bit on the debate on Twitter. And people did lots of video responses to it, and then people started in formats like we're doing now, talking about and talking about it. And I think it's really interesting because I suppose the kind of reason I'm sat here is not because I think it's dying, but because I worry that it could get sidelined, further sidelined rather than dying. And but the point, I was having a very brief Twitter exchange with, is it Rich at Two Fat Lardies?
Rich Clark, yeah,
who I think of as Lardy Rich, because that's what all the people I know call him. Lardy Rich. That's what it is to me, But he's Rich Clark.
Top bloke.
Yeah, Rich Clark is his name. He seems really good. Yeah, I've not had a conversation with him yet, but I've had Twitter exchanges with him. Short ones. And I was saying that I don't think the hobby's dying at all. I think, if anything, it is moving forward slightly. It's probably becoming a bit more popular. But I, as somebody who came in as a pretty much complete cold outsider, 3 years ago, I see it more as a story of unfulfilled potential at the moment, rather than of definite decline. And then I got on. Then Rich was sort of making the point. Well, what's the answer, kind of thing in that case. And I don't know is the answer to that, but because I thought for a long time. I've been going to Partisan for the last 3 years, and I think I've been to all of them in those 3 or 4 years that I've been into. And I think it's a great show. But I came up with this dilemma in my mind. At what point do I take my 6 or 7 year old son to that show?
Yeah.
Do I do it now when he's 6 or 7? Do I do it when he's 10? When he's
You do.
13?
When he's 6 or 7.
Do I just wait until he's been to university?
No, you
Come back with
take him now.
and then take him. I don't know. So
You take him now.
Yeah. So I did. I'm really glad to say that. Well, I took him to Hammerhead.
All right. Yeah. Cool.
The last Hammerhead that happened just before lockdown.
Yeah.
Because it was part of like a Stone Wall put on which is the Wargames group that I knock around with.
Yeah.
And they put on a game, and I went along and played with them. And my son played. And I was really, do you know what? I was really nervous about taking him. And I was thinking that probably within a couple of hours, he's probably going to be bored, and would probably have to leave.
Yeah.
At the end of that day, he said, "Dad, that was the best day out we've ever been on." And I was like, "Are you serious?" Yeah, I am. Which goes to show, doesn't it? And there was no, apart from getting him to wipe his hands, been eating his crisps or whatever, and then picking up my friend Barry's very nicely painted Napoleonics. Apart from having that, that was all I had to do.
But that's the difference. You take them at 6 or 7, you're more likely to get that response than if you leave it to when they're 10 or 11.
Plant the seed. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think, I was that age when my dad was making me stuff, and I was starting to play with toy soldiers, because it's like magic when you're that age. Yeah. By the time, in the UK in particular, I've noticed, by the time kids are like 10, 11, 12, they're cynical, right? They've got more cynical, they've played more computer games, and what have you. At 6 or 7, that's absolutely perfect. Younger than that, it's hard for them to kind of get their head around what's going on. But 6, 7, 8, absolutely perfect time. And particularly, as you say, you took him to Hammerhead, which is an entirely participation game show. Yeah. So everyone there knows that their task is to invite people to come along and play their games and explain to them what's going on and let them handle the stuff. Yeah. Whereas at some other shows, some that will remain nameless, but they haven't been running this year anyway, unfortunately, you do still get that syndrome where you get guys turn up, put on what we laughingly call a demonstration game, and just treat it as like a club night with their backs to the audience, no one explaining what's going on. Doesn't matter if the stuff on the table looks fantastic. It can be intimidating, off-putting, and just, if people don't communicate with you, it's like, not interested then. Whereas Hammerhead, fantastic example, run by Paul and Sally, who run Callistra.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Great people. They do the Hexon terrain and stuff, but also lots of figure ranges now. Lovely people, because they've got a big family themselves, so they're very, very family-oriented. They're very, for donkey's years, they've been having to think, how can we keep the kids entertained, right?
That was my worry, but it was fine.
So they're the perfect people to put on a show like that.
Yeah. Where I was going with that was I mean, you're never going to go to a war game show organizer and say, is it all right to bring kids? And they're never going to say no. They're never going to probably say, well, actually, no, we're not going to stop you from bringing them. We'd rather you didn't bring children under 12 or whatever. No one's ever going to say that publicly, are they? So how do you what's the one I'm trying to get at? How do you decide when to do it? And what do you think should be the approach for just general historical wargaming shows? Should they be actively trying to get kids in by letting them in? Well, I think they do get in for free, don't they, at most? Yeah.
Mostly it's kids under 10 free or whatever. Okay.
Which is encouraging them, isn't it?
It is.
You don't see that many of them at certain shows, even at Partisan, which I think is a pretty friendly show.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. It comes down to a number of things. We have to remember there is no professional wargaming body. Okay. Every show is put on in historical wargaming. In the States, they have the HMGS, which is a kind of organization that, I'll be honest, I don't entirely understand. but it seems to have a role in it seems to have more of a role in kind of organizing the big show of the year, which is Historicon over there, and also rewarding the people that it thinks has made a big contribution to the hobby. They have this thing called the Legion of Honor, which they awarded to Don Featherstone and various other luminaries in the hobby. Recently, the Perry twins got the Legion of Honor. Rich Clark of Two Fat Lardies got the Legion of Honor, and a number of others. Depending on your attitude to these things, you might think, oh gosh, I could win a medal. Or you could be like, I don't give a about medals and stuff. I just want to see the hobby thriving. That's kind of where I am. You know, I'm if I'm an evangelist for the hobby, it's because I love the hobby and I think has so many aspects to offer people.
Yeah.
People of male, female, all colours, all creeds, all genders. I'm completely, pardon the phrase, but colorblind, when it comes to, if that person wants to be a wargamer, don't care what the background is, right? That is all that counts to me. And I think it's been one of the other major problems that we haven't touched on yet, so I'll raise it, which is that historical wargaming in particular has been associated for far too long with 50-something greying, middle-aged, grumpy blokes. Right. I think that's one of the image hurdles that our hobby is now currently working hard to overcome. And I think in the days before social media, before the internet, it was very hard because the people who ran the magazines, the people who wrote into the magazines, the people who wrote the magazine articles were 50-something greying and middle-aged blokes. Whereas now, because of the explosion of the internet and social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch streams, Patreon, all these things, it's become much more apparent that the demographic of the hobby, and certainly the potential demographic of the hobby, is limitless. And it's just a matter of helping people to overcome any feeling of intimidation about what they're facing. Now, in terms of bringing more very young people into the hobby, as you were talking about, like at shows, it's quite tricky because you have, first of all, to rely on and it's always a club that organizes the shows, whether it's the Giant Salute in Excel or, Hammerhead's actually the exception where you've actually got a business running a war game show. And of course, in many respects, perhaps no surprise, that's why Hammerhead's one of the best run shows in the country on the calendar. They're really good at what they do. They're incredibly efficient. They're very businesslike. Now, some of the best run club shows are similar. They're very efficient, but they're relying on volunteers, right? They are relying on volunteers. And of course, it's been we've had a number of spectacular examples in recent years, certainly in the last decade, where unfortunately internal club politics have affected even the ability of a show to run. I'm not going to name any names, but experienced wargamers out there know the shows I'm talking about, where unfortunately internal personality clashes or cliques have led to the demise of a show or problems with a show. And when you're organizing a show, you have all these different considerations. I mean, sympathies to the people that do, because you have, on the one hand, if we stand back and say, right, I'm organizing a show, my primary objective is how can I encourage more young people to come to our show? But also alongside that, it's like, in order to pay for the show, we just need to get as many people in the door as possible, and more importantly, as many traders as possible to come and set up stall and sell stuff at the show. So if you like, politically, it's a balancing act between the kind of show you want to let the public have and the kind of show you want the traders to have and the expenses involved in all of that. So unfortunately, I think that like organising.
It's for someone
Yeah,
who
yeah.
knows what they're doing, isn't it? It really
Yeah.
is. It really is.
It really is. You know, you could be with the best will in the world. You could be, you know, a top senior manager in a multinational company, and it would be a challenge to balance these competing things. But in a sense, I kind of feel, therefore, that what, you know, the best shows need, you know, if they're not already doing it, one idea is they need to appoint at least one person, and I would suggest maybe two people of differently gendered people, let me put it that way, who take charge of the kind of demographic they want to attract to the show. So they think about, how do we get more young kids involved in the show? How do we encourage the people putting on the games to ensure that there's nothing they're doing that's going to be intimidating to anyone who's younger? Because it's very easy, you know, if you're a 6-foot bloke and you're standing talking to people, your head height's up here, and so you're looking at and focusing on other people of where the head height is approximately the same. You actually have to stop and think, look down, is there a small person nearby who I could also be addressing, right? And it takes a particular kind of attitude as well, because let's be honest, some people are great with kids, other people not so much. The other thing is, when you're talking about bringing kids to a show, well, there are some parents, some dads who think, yeah, like you, I want to take my son to the war game show and get him involved and interested and excited about this stuff. Right? There are other people who think the last thing I want is to be saddled with my kids, right? Because I want to go shopping, which is one of the things that happens at a lot of these shows now. It's the one chance I get to see these products in the flesh, and I've got a couple of hours. I want to get around the show, do my shopping. I don't want to be saddled with little Jimmy. And because one of the problems that shows have had is that, let's say, imagine a conversation at home. Mum says to Dad, oh, go on, take little Jimmy with you. He'll love it. And Dad's...
The conversation happened before I took mine. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Take him with you. He'll love it. He'll love it. And Dad's going, oh, all right, I want to do some shopping, really, but okay. Right. Come on, son. You get to the show, and I've seen it happen. Dad said, there's a nice looking game, right? Dad says to little Jimmy, you just wait here, be a good boy, wait here, play the game here. I'm just off to look at some stuff. And what happens is the people running that game become babysitters. I've seen it happen many, many times, and I've heard people running games complain afterwards about, you know, we're getting a bit fed up with people just dumping their kids on us. We're not trained childminders. We're there supposed to be running a game and addressing other people, but suddenly we've got 3 or 4 little lads or even little girls, right, dumped on the table with us. What on earth are we supposed to do? I mean, there's all sorts of legislation that you have to be really careful about these days as well, right?
I mean,
I have seen that happen lots of times.
I mean, I would never do that, even though my 7-year-old is pretty well behaved. I would never even be doing that for all the reasons you've just said. But I think you have to be somehow police that, don't you? Yes.
Now, there are, to their enormous credit, and I've seen particularly Hammerhead and Partisan, there's a bunch of guys from the RAF Wargames Club.
I've seen them.
Who purposely put on games for young children. You know, they've done Minions race games and, you know, all sorts of stuff. And they are brilliant. They are brilliant. Now, they are deliberately saying to people, right, we're putting on games for young kids, right? So there is a limited number of spaces, but if you come and say, right, can I leave my kid with you to do the games for an hour or whatever it is at that time, fantastic. Now that, if there was more people prepared or able to, because not everyone is able to, put on a game like that is deliberately aimed at young children. All the people running the game have been, I can't remember, it's a particular police check, isn't it, that they check your background, that you're not, you know, a child molester or anything like that. Then they're accredited, and parents can safely think, oh, that's wonderful. They're going to love playing that game with those guys who are brilliant showmen, showmanship and looking after the kids, and I know I then have an hour and 90 minutes, whatever it is, where I can quite happily go off and do some shopping.
I need to do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that as an idea, if people are looking for ideas about how to encourage kids to shows, more games like that, organized by people like that, that's one way of doing it. Yeah. Obviously, the other thing you could potentially do is hire, if you have people in your number, because I know there's quite a few guys who are in the war games hobby in Nottingham, in fact, several I know, who are teachers. That's what they do for a living. And obviously are qualified to advise on activities that young people might enjoy that are, yes, wargaming related, not necessarily very heavy on the military side of things, because I think that's one of the other things that as historical wargamers, we have to be, we just do have to be conscious of that these days.
This is something that Rick Clark said to me in that brief Twitter conversation where he was saying, when I said that it's one of unfulfilled, the hobby story is one of unfulfilled potential to me. He's like, what do you mean? I said, well, why not do more things with museums, with schools, with universities? And he said briefly that he made an attempt at something with schools.
I can tell you about that.
The real resistance to, or there was a bit of a resistance to, or a concern around something that's based around something that's military, basically.
I can tell you a specific sort of story related to what Rich means. When my book, The Wargaming Compendium, was published, 2013, Rich was, bless his heart, he was one of my biggest cheerleaders. He loved the book, and he loved the fact that it was addressing the very audience we're talking about, that for youngsters, newcomers into the hobby, I deliberately had written a book that no book had been written like that for like 30 years.
It's unlike any other book that's been published recently, I found, in the last 10 years, because I've read lots of books recently that have been published in the last 10. And yours is nothing like any of those.
No, absolutely, and deliberately so. I was deliberately thinking.
For people that, sorry, Henry. For people that don't know what we're talking about, that are yet to read Henry's wonderful book, it's not necessarily aimed at somebody who's been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. It literally starts at the beginning, as in what is a war game. It talks about the concept of how height and using height in the terrain can affect the game. It talks about dice. It talks about probability. It talks about how you can dictate things with cards and explains all that. So it is wonderful it's a wonderful addition if you're getting into the hobby and you are getting a bit baffled, a bit perplexed, but you don't want to tell anybody. Pick up Henry's book, right? And in there will be a few things where you can read that and you can go back to the club or the group.
God bless you.
Like, no problem with that card system now. No,
You're a bit fuzzy on, when was the Renaissance? What was the Renaissance period? What was the Landsknecht? What sort of tanks did they have in the early World War II? Yeah, that's why I wrote it. Essentially, Chris, I wrote the book that I wish I'd had available to me when I started wargaming. Yeah. So basically all those concepts about, what is a war game? What are the different ways of playing a war game?
I use it, by the way. That's why I used the book. I didn't read
Fantastic.
I didn't read it from cover to cover. I read big sections of it and I go back to it every now and again.
Fantastic.
More about this that will make me understand this in Henry's book.
Yeah. No, so that's exactly why I wrote it. It's like, if I was coming into the hobby now, where could I go? Because you can Google, and in a million pages around the internet, you can gradually amass this information, but a lot of it's confusing, conflicting and stuff. It's just tell me the basics, right? Yeah. Tell me, what are these different scales? What's the difference between a battle and a campaign? What's the difference between strategy and tactics? What's give me a basic set of rules to play something. So in there's a set for playing a simple gladiator game in which you can learn a bit of Latin as well, funnily enough. There's a Wild West guns, shoot 'em out Wild West set, and there's a horse and musket era kind of a big battle game sort of rule set as well. And I give pointers to lots of other stuff where you can find it. I think one of the things that a lot of people have found most useful is actually right at the back. I've got a huge resources section. Just, here are all the different figure manufacturers, here are the terrain manufacturers and stuff. It was the most boring bit of the book to put together, but I think it's had more comments than anything else that,
all there,
But let's go back to Rich Clark, because when that book came out, right?
Yep.
Rich was over the moon. I mean, he's a lovely bloke. We get on famously. And he was so, oh God, Henry, the hobbies needed something like this for donkey's years. I tell you what, I'm going to go out and pimp your book around schools, right? I'm going to get it into school libraries and stuff. Can you ask the publishers if I can get a discounted rate if I manage to flog, 1,000 copies into schools or whatever? I say, Rich, mate, that's absolutely amazing. God, I'll be blown away if you manage to do that. That'd be fantastic. Not one school would even accept a copy free. I know he was kind of heartbroken. I was less heartbroken because I thought, do you know what? I'm not that surprised because of all sorts of things nowadays. First of all, a lot of schools no longer have school libraries, right? I was brought up in that generation where the school library, when I was at school, I'd started playing war. That's where I discovered Donald Featherstone. Turns out one of my teachers, my maths teacher, was a war gamer. So he'd convinced the school bursar or whatever to fork out however many pounds it was to get everything that Donald Featherstone ever wrote. So our school library, that's where I found Don Featherstone. Amazing, right? Nowadays, they don't have school libraries so what's this? It's about wargaming? Oh, we're not sure about that. Not sure about that now. Oh no, we don't really teach kind of that sort of history anymore. And even though Rich points out, well, look, there's stuff in there about fantasy and sci-fi and also, they don't have war games clubs anymore. So poor Rich, he put his heart and soul in trying to pimp my book around and got nowhere. Which is a sign of the times. Now, my feeling is, okay, we tried that avenue. Sadly, it's blocked. So what else can we do instead? And even in the last, so that was published 2013, 2020. In the last 7 years, just look at what's happened to the internet and the online world. It's mushroomed, right? And so now I wouldn't bother trying to get into schools that way. I do what we were mentioning earlier, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and all the other online channels, Instagram, that are now available, where you stand a far better chance if you're clever and intelligent with the way you use your hashtags and, what you link to and how you link and stuff. That's a much more likely way that someone's going to stumble across something and go
school.
They're going to stumble across it and go, oh, or they're going to find your podcast, right? And they're going to go, what's he talking about? Oh, that's quite interesting. Oh, what's this? Look at the links under the video and what have you. Realistically now, the old traditional methods of, outreach, which used to always be send stuff into school libraries, do tours of schools, write to the headmaster and say, oh, we'd like to come and put on a war game for your lads. Right? It's not going to happen nowadays. We have to be more intelligent, more quick on our feet. The business buzzword is more able to pivot quickly. When we try one thing, find that doesn't work, okay, we switch our direction. Good analogy to military tactics, actually, like blitzkrieg. You push forward. If you hit resistance, right, switch to somewhere else.
Okay, everybody, that's the end of part 1 of this interview with Henry. In part 2, we discuss all sorts, including his collections and the things that he's most proud of. And also we talk a bit about his health and how he's getting on with his battle with prostate cancer. So I'll include a link when it's done to part 2, but well done for getting this far. Thanks for listening. See you soon.